Welcome back. After the SolarWinds breach, some leaders are calling for a grand strategy of resilience. Implementing a resilience-focused strategy could mean taking cues from the private sector. Erica Borghard is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, senior director at the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and writing about resilience and war on the rocks. Welcome, Erica. Thanks very much for coming on. What does a grand strategy based on resilience look like in your view?
Thank you so much for having me. So from my perspective, a grand strategy based on resilience is linked to the idea of deterrence, which is a longstanding concept in American grand strategy, but it has its own sort of distinct characteristics. And so deterrence is grounded in the logic of preventing adversaries from taking some undesirable action, either by threatening them with punishment if they do so, or shoring up your own defenses so that the costs of carrying out that action are perceived to be too high. And resilience can help with that latter part of deterrence, but in a unique way. And so if the US is able to withstand and rapidly recover from disruptive events, which I think we're all starting to recognize are an inevitable part of our lives, then over time, adversaries may find that carrying out these kinds of disruptive events are simply less appealing. But this thinking is distinct from traditional deterrence in an important way because it doesn't aim to perfectly prevent all disruptions from happening. So in the context of nuclear deterrence, even one failure would be catastrophic. But with the resilience framework, we can anticipate that disruptions are likely to occur and therefore focus on investing in improving our ability to be better prepared to withstand and recover from them.
So the nuclear parallel, I think, is a good one. There's one main difference, though. The inevitability of the cyber, the necessity for cyber resilience strikes me as the main differential. We're going to get hacked again. We're not necessarily going to get nuked again. Or ever, hopefully. And so I wonder what difference that makes in the way that one thinks about a resilient framework, Erica.
Yeah, so I think the difference it makes is really focusing less on trying to sort of perfectly deter these disruptive events from happening and rather focus on improving our defenses, improving the government collaboration with the private sector, which as we know in cyberspace owns and operates most of the infrastructure, even the infrastructure that the government relies on, and doing a better job of sharing intelligence, preparing, planning, exercising so that we're better prepared when those inevitable disruptions occur.
What can we learn from the private sector? What can the government learn from the private sector in terms of resilience, Erica?
So what's interesting about the private sector, and I'd call it the financial services sector in particular, is the private sector has done a lot of work in developing resilience frameworks, in identifying best practices. And what I find interesting is that sometimes that's been spurred by regulatory action or guidance, especially in financial services, which has motivated that sector to develop resilience frameworks. And so I think that the government has done a bit of learning from the private sector already, and you've seen this within the Department of Homeland Security and its effort to identify national critical functions. But what I see as the biggest challenge is that we don't have a systematic and comprehensive national resilience strategy. And this was an important recommendation that came out of the Congressional Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So while there have been some good first steps in incorporating this idea of resilience, I would say the US government needs to develop a comprehensive strategy that systematically identifies critical national functions across the government and the private sector, and then builds and manages resources to mitigate risk. So really putting those resources and investments behind that strategy will be critical, and that's an area where the government can learn from the private sector.
We always talk on this program when comparing the government and the private sector about the different motivations, mission versus return on investment, but it strikes me that there's a parallel there too for the government to think about, learning from fintech that they've got a whole lot of money at stake, just like we have a whole lot of national security assets at stake. Is that a fair parallel, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a fair parallel, and I would also add that it's not as though the government doesn't do a lot of these functions already, right? So the government does threat intelligence and threat modeling. It does dependency mapping in some ways. It does readiness planning and testing and exercising. The challenge is really developing that comprehensive and holistic strategy, and also incorporating the private sector, especially critical infrastructure, into every step of that process.
What will you watch as this develops, whether it's from your position at AC, from your position as part of the Solarium Council, any of that? Where does this go, do you think?
So I think we have a great opportunity with the incoming Biden administration to to see how the Biden administration will be prioritizing resilience. And I'd look at who are the individuals they're putting into key roles, particularly at DHS and on the National Security Council. And I also would keep an eye out on the regulatory space. There's a lot of sort of interesting emerging regulation around these issues that kind of illustrates the nexus between the government and the private sector here.
Erica, thanks very much for coming on. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. It was great being here.